So let's talk about some of the contributing factors to things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. So the first thing that you need to understand is insulin resistance. Why? Because most people that have a fatty liver have insulin resistance going on in their body. So what is insulin resistance? In order to understand this concept, you first need to understand what insulin is. Insulin is a hormone that is secreted by your pancreas anytime that your blood sugar spikes or goes up, especially after you eat carbohydrates and proteins. Now, insulin is like a key. It's a key that goes into the different cells, like this green circle, it's a cell with a little keyhole. Insulin acts like a key that goes into the keyhole of the cells throughout your entire body, unlocks that cell and opens certain doors and pathways that allow the cell to then absorb glucose from the bloodstream and into itself so that it can use it for fuel. Now, insulin resistance refers to the fact that when insulin no longer is able to open that door because it no longer fits into that keyhole, so to speak. And when that happens, then your cells become insulin resistant. They don't respond to insulin and therefore they don't open their doors and pull glucose from your bloodstream and into the cells, which can be a very dangerous situation, which many diabetics, for example, are well aware of. So what happens when you have constant levels of high amounts of insulin because you're eating constant amounts of carbohydrates, sugar, etc., which then spike your blood sugar? Your pancreas then has to spit out a lot of insulin throughout the day constantly in order to deal with all of this glucose in your blood. However, after a certain amount of time, if this is continuously happening over the course of many months, many years, etc., then your cells become desensitized. They no longer respond very well to insulin, and therefore they don't get the message to open the doors and pull the glucose out of the blood, which then causes a problem because now you have all of this glucose floating around in your blood, which then triggers other issues. Now, when this happens, when you have an elevated amount of insulin and you develop insulin resistance, things like glucose levels in your blood start to go up, right? Because your cells aren't pulling them back into themselves. And when glucose levels in the blood start to go up, they'll eventually make themselves all the way into the liver because your liver doesn't need insulin to absorb glucose. There are specific doorways that doesn't need a key. They're just always open to glucose. And so when you have elevated amounts of glucose, a lot of that glucose goes straight into your liver and gets turned into fat, right? Makes sense. The next thing that happens is that your liver starts to produce a ton of glucose in and of itself because insulin inhibits your liver's ability to produce glucose, new glucose from other sources of fuel. And when your liver becomes insulin resistant, it no longer gets the message to stop producing glucose for the rest of the body and instead starts producing more and more and more uncontrollably. Now, the other thing that happens is that you get a buildup of the levels of insulin in your blood because when your cells become insulin resistant, then your pancreas tries to overcompensate by producing more insulin to try to force the cell to respond to it. And that leads to really high levels of insulin in your blood, also known as hyperinsulinemia. Now, when you have high levels of insulin, this is a problem because insulin inhibits fat burning. It stops or inhibits the process of lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat for fuel. And so when you have constant high levels of insulin floating around in your body, it makes it very difficult to lose weight, which is why people who have insulin resistance usually have a really hard time to burn excess fat, especially in the liver and in the rest of the body. Now, the next factor they need to understand is de novo lipogenesis, or the creation of new fat in the liver specifically. De novo means new, lipo means fat, genesis means the creation of. So that's what that word means. Now, in the presence of high amounts of insulin in the blood, like in the case of insulin resistance, and also with a large amount of calories being ingested and the majority of those calories coming from glucose and fructose, then you set yourself up in a situation where your liver starts to produce new fat and to store it within its own liver cells. Now, it's important to note that most fat in the liver actually comes from this process that is sourced from glucose, from carbohydrates, excess amount of carbohydrates, especially low fiber carbohydrates and fructose. A lot of people think that eating a lot of dietary fat, like saturated fats, actually worsens and contributes a large amount of fat into the liver, but dietary fat only contributes to about 10 to 15% of the total amount of fat in your liver, so not so much. The majority of it comes from excess carbohydrates, sugars, fructose, like in soda, candy, junk food, etc. Now, one thing that you need to understand that when the glucose starts to enter your bloodstream, like you can see here, the glucose is the blue circles, fructose is the green X's. When they start to enter the bloodstream, they go straight into the liver. Now, once they go into the liver, your liver has two options. It could either store it as glycogen, which is a stored form of glucose, or it could store it as fat. It's going to first try to store it as glycogen. However, there's a maximum amount of glycogen that your liver can store, about 100 grams, give or take, depending on the individual. And so once that maxes out, and it doesn't take very long, especially if you're eating a lot of refined carbohydrates, it'll start to convert all that glucose and fructose into fat into the liver at an accelerated rate in order to help deal with all of this glucose, this constant high level of glucose, which is even worse when you're insulin resistant because this glucose isn't getting pulled from your bloodstream. And so your liver, even more so, starts to pull that into itself and store it as fat. The thing about glucose that you need to understand is that glucose metabolism in the liver is very tightly regulated. In order for glucose to become fat, it has to go through several different steps in order to actually do so. And so it's a very tightly regulated, a very controlled process. Now with fructose, fructose has the ability to bypass all of the steps. It doesn't have to go through the different steps to become fat. It'll just go straight into fat. And so every time you consume large amount of fructose, especially high fructose corn syrup or sodas or anything like that, you're literally injecting your liver with fat because it instantly gets converted more or less into fat very quickly without having to go through all the different steps, which is another very important reason why not to consume large amounts of fructose and glucose. The other thing that happens at this point is because you have now elevated amounts of fat, especially once you start to reach 5%, right, or more of fat in your liver, which is the diagnostic criteria of a fatty liver. Once you start to develop 5% or more, then you start to develop too much fat in the liver, and you start to develop a toxic level of fat in the liver. Now, when you have toxic levels of fat in the liver itself, it triggers an immune response because your liver cells your liver in general has its own immune system, has its own white blood cells called Kupffer cells that patrol the different cells and the different pathways within the liver to get rid of bacteria, etc. But when you have high amounts of fat, your immune cells start to activate and starts to look at this fat as an enemy and it'll start to attack it. And when that happens, as we all know, when we trigger an immune response anywhere in the body, you also trigger inflammation, which is a really big problem because now you have all this fat that's getting attacked by these macrophages, right? By these Kupffer cells. They're just going in there and they're attacking this fat because there's too much of it and it's starting to hurt the liver and it starts to treat it as a foreign invader. Now, when this happens over a long period of time because you haven't stopped eating refined sugars and fructose and you haven't changed your diet and you haven't done the lifestyle changes that you need to do, what ends up happening is that you have a chronic state of inflammation. You're constantly inflamed in your liver cells. And when you have a constant level of inflammation, eventually your liver cells will start to die and they'll start to be destroyed. And when they start to get destroyed, they'll be replaced by scar tissue. And once you're at this level, you start to enter fibrosis. If you remember the progression of NAFLD, this is when you start to enter the fibrosis, and if you still don't do anything to correct this and do the necessary changes in your life, it'll eventually progress to cirrhosis and then eventually to cancer. You'll need a liver transplant at some point and even potentially die from this. So this is how the inflammation starts to set in and starts to progress into more serious aspects of NAFLD. I also want to mention that insulin levels, high amounts of insulin levels that occur with insulin resistance stimulate this process. It promotes this process. When you have high amounts of insulin, your liver is being told to do this over and over and over and over again nonstop. The next factor I want to talk about is dyslipidemia. Now let's break this down, right? So dys means dysfunction, lipid means fat, emia means blood. So it's the dysfunction of fat cells or fat in the bloodstream. Now, what does this mean? So when we have high levels of insulin, right, like how we do in insulin resistance, we're consuming large amounts of calories, we're starting to gain weight, and our fat cells start to become really big and enlarged, then we run into this condition called dyslipidemia. Now, what is it? So in a lean individual, right, in a quote-unquote skinny individual, the fat cells, which are these circles here, these black circles, are relatively small, right? They're spaced out, they have room, they're not compacted into each other because the person is lean. You don't have a large fat cells. Now, in the case of overweight people, their fat cells become enlarged. They become really, really big, and they start to compress and run into each other. See these forces? They start to compress into each other. And what happens when you have this level of mechanical pressure when you're overweight is that it'll limit the amount of nutrients and oxygen that'll enter the actual fat cells that it needs in order to function properly. Now, when you have a combination of the mechanical pressure and the lack of nutrients and oxygen, what ends up happening is that your fat cells start to release different fatty acids into your bloodstream, okay? It'll start to release these fatty acids, which is basically fat. The other thing that's going to release is inflammatory cytokines, right? These molecules that promote inflammation. And you can see here how this is going to make things worse, because as your fat cells that are found all over your body in mass start to release fat into your bloodstream and start to release inflammation into your bloodstream, that'll eventually reach your liver, and it'll just aggravate the amount of fat content. It'll increase the fat content because that's all going into there. And it'll also increase and worsen the inflammation, which we already established leads to the destruction of the cells, scar tissue, fibrosis, and beyond, further aggravating this entire process. And this is why losing weight is a really important factor in reversing fatty liver disease and metabolic syndrome. Now, the last factor that I want to talk about is genetics, right? Your genetic predisposition to develop fatty liver disease. And we're going to be focusing on the PNAPL3 gene. If you have this gene, studies show that you'll most likely have double the amount of liver fat compared to people that don't have this gene. The other thing they need to know about this specific gene is that it'll actually promote every single stage of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So everything from fatty liver to fibrosis, cirrhosis, and beyond, this gene will specifically promote and support each and every stage of this disease and the progression of it. Now, who has this gene, right? There have been studies that have been done here in the United States and throughout the world. Here in the United States, 48% of Hispanic Americans or folks that are of Hispanic origins are going to have this gene. That's almost half of the population here in the United States. So if you're Hispanic, you especially need to be aware of this and take into consideration. 35% of East Asian Americans, right? People of East Asian descent, like for example, India, etc., also have this gene. 23% of European Americans or Americans with European descent have this gene. And lastly, 12% of African Americans, which was the lowest occurrence as far as demographics are concerned, actually have this gene. So congratulations, African Americans, you most likely don't have it. So the last thing I want to mention is that although genetics is something that we're often told we can't do much about, it is important to understand, and this is often said in the functional medicine and nutrition world, genetics load the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger. Meaning you may have these genes. I myself, I'm a Hispanic American, and I probably have this gene, right? But it's the environment, it's the food that you eat, your stress level, your nutrition, your exercise, your lifestyle is what will trigger this gene to express itself and then predispose you to developing fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, etc. So we talked a lot about the factors that can contribute to the development of fatty liver disease, etc. But what can we do to actually reverse it or to improve it? Well, the first thing that you should glean from this information is the overconsumption of glucose and fructose. When you consume too much glucose in the form of carbohydrates, especially low fiber and high sugar carbohydrates, that is going to lead to insulin resistance, right? Which will then contribute to de novo lipogenesis, which will then make you gain weight and develop dyslipidemia, more than likely. And if you have the genetic predisposition, you're much more likely to develop fatty liver disease altogether. So the glucose and fructose consumption needs to be under control. You need to reduce the amount of fructose, in my opinion, altogether, especially if you've been diagnosed with the fatty liver, but also glucose, right? Eat more high fiber foods instead of the chips and the bread and the rice and the pastas, etc. Luckily, in this program, you have the meal plan that covers all of this, but just so that you know in the future, these are the two biggest contributing factors to this issue.